No one expected the will to read like that. Not the wife who had stood beside Harold Whitmore for almost 4 decades. Not the two children who grew up believing they would one day inherit the empire he built from nothing. And certainly not the board of directors of Whitgrove Market, but one of the largest supermarket chains in the country. Yet there it was. Clear, legal, final, 90% of Harold's estate, entrusted to Caleb Monroe, the adopted son, a name that had rarely been mentioned in public, a face that appeared in few family photographs. To the world, Caleb was a quiet figure in the background. To the family, he was a shadow, not born into their blood, not raised among them, just a boy Harold had taken in after a car accident claimed Caleb's parents. But that boy had become the sole inheritor of nearly $700 million. Real estate across 4 states, luxury properties in Aspen, Miami, and Cape Cod, majority shares in Whitgrove's parent company, antique collections, personal art archives, even the private plane, not a token sum, not a sentimental gesture, nearly everything. The moment the will was read, the room changed. The silence cracked like thin glass. Gasps. A wine glass shattered to the floor. And Margaret Whitmore, Harold's widow, let out a sound no one had heard from her in years. Not a sob, not a cry, but a sharp, breathless whisper. "No, this isn't right." Her son Nathan stood up so fast his chair tipped backwards. "This isn't legal. He's not even..." He didn't finish. The lawyer cleared his throat, voice neutral but firm. "Mr. Whitmore updated this testament 11 months ago, fully coherent, witnessed, and notarized. The decision is binding." Around the long oak table, eyes darted in every direction. The family accountant looked down. The in-house counsel shifted in his seat. Not one of them had seen this coming. Not even Harold's closest legal advisors. From that moment on, the narrative began to shift. Behind closed doors, across newsrooms, over whispering dinner tables. The question was no longer who got what. It became who was Caleb Monroe. Really? A quiet man, late 30s, always polite, lived in a modest cabin at the edge of Harold's summer estate, never spoke out of turn, never asked for anything. He didn't attend social events. He didn't stand beside Harold at public galas. He didn't appear in the official family portraits framed along the hallway. But someone must have known, because within 48 hours, legal motions were filed. The Whitmore family accused Caleb of coercion, manipulation, even fraud. They claimed he had exploited an aging man's emotions to secure the fortune, that the will was a fabrication of intimacy. Headlines exploded. Adopted son takes it all. Billionaire heir or mastermind. From orphan to overlord. In Caleb, he said nothing. He didn't appear on television. He didn't issue a press release. He didn't even return to the main house. Instead, he sat alone at the far edge of the estate, in the small cabin he'd shared with Harold for the past 15 years. Not as father and son, not as caretaker and patient, but something else entirely, something no one had dared to name. Yet, they thought they understood the betrayal. They thought this was about money. But the truth, like Harold's love, had been buried under silence for years. And now the silence was beginning to crack. Because no paper trail lasts forever. And no man dies without leaving something behind, especially not a man like Harold Whitmore. If you've ever wondered what it means to love in hiding, if you've ever questioned whether legacy is built on blood or loyalty, then stay with us. This is the story of Caleb Monroe and how a man once called a charity case became the only one Harold Whitmore ever truly trusted. This is Heart Stories. Real stories for hearts that have endured. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this. You're about to witness a truth the world wasn't ready for. They moved quickly. Within 2 days, Margaret Whitmore and her children had filed a formal petition to contest the will. The claim was predictable yet devastating. They alleged manipulation. They alleged psychological control. They alleged that Caleb Monroe had taken advantage of an aging, vulnerable man to rewrite an empire's future. The papers filed were sharp and calculated. They questioned Harold's mental clarity. They described Caleb as an outsider, a former foster child, a man with no proven loyalty to the Whitmore legacy. They painted him as a shadow who crept his way into the family's fortune, uninvited and undeserving. And then the press took over. He was everywhere. Tabloids, primetime, morning radio. The charity son who took the fortune, a greed in a cabin. He called him father until he didn't. Photos of Caleb at past family events resurfaced. In each one, he stood at the edge of the frame, never touching Harold, never standing too close. But now every smile, every glance was reinterpreted. The public no longer saw an adopted son. They saw a strategy. They saw a long game. Meanwhile, Caleb remained silent. He didn't call a lawyer. He didn't give an interview. He didn't ask for sympathy. Instead, he withdrew. Back to the quiet cabin. Back to the garden Harold once built with his own hands. Back to silence. But the family wasn't done. They petitioned the board of Whitgrove Market to freeze Caleb's rights. They argued that he posed a risk to the brand, to shareholders, to the reputation Harold spent his life building. Behind the scenes, their lawyers dug into Caleb's past, old medical records, school transcripts, psychological evaluations from his teenage years after the car crash. They wanted to discredit him, not just as an heir, but as a human being. They reached out to former staff members, anyone who had seen Caleb alone with Harold. They searched for evidence of manipulation, of seduction, of betrayal. One of Harold's former assistants described Caleb as polite, private, and always loyal. Another said, "He never once asked for anything." But these testimonies were drowned out because Margaret had gone public. She stood in front of a bank of microphones and cameras, elegant, measured, the image of the grieving widow. "My husband would never abandon his children. He would never humiliate us like this. We believe that the will was tampered with. We will not be silent." And for a while, she controlled the story. She had the headlines. She had the money. She had the legacy. But what she didn't have was the truth, because the truth, with Bus, was still sitting in a lockbox inside Caleb's cabin, wrapped in Harold's handwriting, unopened since the day Harold passed. And when that box was finally opened, the world would learn that not all families are built from blood. Some are built from secrets and love. The house was empty, not the kind of empty that comes with absence, the kind that settles in after grief has taken everything else. Caleb stood in Harold's study, untouched since the funeral. The scent of old books still lingered. Dust gathered in corners of the window panes. On the desk, a leather blotter, perfectly aligned pens, in one small wooden box. That box had been there for years. Everyone assumed it held business papers, contracts, ledgers, nothing emotional. But Caleb knew better. It had no lock, no grand carvings, just the initials H.W. engraved at the corner. He opened it like someone reaching back through time. Inside letters, dozens, all addressed to my love, no return name, no pretense. The handwriting was unmistakable Harold's, delicate, firm, consistent, just like him. The first envelope was dated over 15 years ago. The paper had yellowed at the edges, still folded precisely. Caleb held it for a moment before reading. His hands trembled, not out of fear, but recognition. "My love," it began, "tonight you sat by the fireplace, reading, the dog asleep at your feet. You didn't notice me watching you. It's always when you're unaware that I remember what home feels like." The second letter spoke of a gala, a $1,000 tuxedo, champagne flutes, meaningless conversation. But across the room, Harold had spotted Caleb quiet, near the back. "You were the only reason I didn't leave," he wrote. "The only real thing in a room full of mirrors." Each letter was a time capsule. Moments preserved not for memory, but for survival, written in silence, never sent, never shared. A journal, almost, but one written to someone present, not absent. And that made all the difference. Some letters were long, poetic, others only a paragraph, but all of them carried the same tone reverence. The kind of language men like Harold were never allowed to speak in public. There were no confessions of scandal, no manipulations, only grief for the life they could never fully live. In one letter, Harold recounted the day he first heard Caleb laugh after his mother passed. I wanted to bottle it, not the sound, the fact that I had helped bring it back. Another was written the day Harold signed the adoption papers. They call you my son now. That's fine. They'll never understand that love doesn't need correction, only cover. Caleb read for hours. At some point, night had fallen, but he hadn't noticed. He hadn't moved. Tears had dried on his cheeks, his fingers stained faintly with ink. The silence in the cabin no longer felt empty. It felt dense, like all those years were pressing themselves back into the room. He understood now Harold hadn't written these letters to explain. He wrote them to endure, to hold on to something real while living a life built on compromise. It wasn't just a love story, it was a record of survival. A man who owned a corporation, who shook hands with senators, who sat on magazine covers. And yet, his greatest treasures were these ink-stained memories, hidden in a box beneath a window where light rarely reached. Caleb could have released them to the press, used them as leverage, but he didn't. Because some truths weren't meant for defense, they were meant for honor. And in that moment, Caleb knew this wasn't a war for image. It was a memory to protect. So he closed the box, not to forget, but to keep safe. The day of the hearing arrived with no storm, just sunlight, bright, clinical, unforgiving. Outside the courthouse, cameras gathered like flies. Journalists whispered assumptions into microphones. He was adopted late. Wasn't he odd for a billionaire to give 90% to a so-called son? Some are calling it grooming. Inside, the atmosphere was colder. Rows of polished benches, legal pads stacked like ammunition, the scent of wood polish and old carpet. Margaret Whitmore walked in wearing a sharp black dress. Not mourning, strategy. Her children followed. 3 sons, 1 daughter, all wearing dark suits, all matching resentment. On the other side sat Caleb, alone. No lawyers flanking him, no team in sleek suits whispering case law. Just him, in a single briefcase. Inside it, 1 envelope. The case was never about property, it was about perception. They accused him of manipulation, that he had poisoned an old man's mind, that the will was forged in influence, not affection, that no one in their right mind would give away an empire like that. Expert after expert took the stand. Psychologists discussed dependency loops. Financial advisors detailed Caleb's access to bank accounts. One family friend even suggested that Harold's dementia had softened his judgment. No one used the word love. It was either delusion or deception. They described Caleb like a virus that had infected a legacy, a stranger who had wrapped himself in family titles, then sunk his claws into an old man's need for comfort. The prosecution's final argument was brutal. They displayed side-by-side images of Harold in his youth and Harold weeks before his death. This is not a man making decisions, they said. This is a man being directed. And all the while, Caleb sat silent, not weak, but contained. His eyes didn't plead. They didn't challenge. They only held still. When asked to speak, he stood without hesitation. He didn't launch into defense. No dramatic speech. Instead, he handed the judge 1 envelope, not from a lawyer, from Harold. "Admitted into record," the clerk announced, and then a voice read aloud. "I have spent my life curating a name, a company, a legacy, but none of it has been mine. Really, not the name, not the love I claimed, not the family I was expected to perform. Caleb was not my son in blood. He was the love I could never name in daylight. Silence followed. True silence. Even the journalists put their pens down. The judge's face didn't change, but something shifted in the room often. The walls felt less aligned with wealth and more with weight. The final ruling came the next morning. The court upheld the will. 90% of the estate remained with Caleb Monroe. There was no fraud, no undue influence, only choice. Deliberate, private, painfully human. Margaret left the courthouse without speaking. Her children trailed behind, looking less like heirs and more like ghosts. Caleb didn't celebrate. There was no statement, no interviews, no smirk of victory. He walked back to his car alone. Inside the glove box, he placed the letter, not to hide it, but because it didn't need to be read again. Its truth had already been spoken. The verdict made headlines for 3 days, and then, like all things that don't bleed, it disappeared. But not for Caleb. He didn't return to the city, didn't tour the chain of markets now under his name, didn't sit in the boardroom where Harold had once ruled with quiet command. Instead, he went back to the lake. The cabin still stood, same chipped paint, same creaking porch, same slant of sun through the west-facing window in late afternoon. He didn't redecorate, he didn't renovate, he preserved. Each morning, he brewed coffee the way Harold liked it. Dark, quiet, no cream, no comment. The foundation he created bore no photo of himself. It was named only for H.W. It issued no press releases. It opened no offices in tall glass buildings. But it worked. Young men and women, abandoned by parents, evicted from dorms, forgotten by churches, began to find quiet shelter. Elderly couples, together for decades yet never married, found legal counsel. Men like Harold, powerful on paper but alone in silence, were no longer alone. Donations came in steadily, not from CEOs or celebrities, from everyday people. One letter came from a nurse in Minnesota. She wrote, "My uncle never said he was gay. He just never married. I wish he had someone like Caleb when he was alive." Another came from a former Marine. He simply said, "You didn't just inherit money, you inherited pain, and you turned it into something good." But Caleb never replied. Not because he didn't care, because he didn't want to be canonized. He had already been erased once, labeled a fraud, a scheme, a name on paper. He didn't need to be turned into a saint. He just wanted to finish what Harold had started, a life where love didn't have to justify itself. On the anniversary of Harold's death, Caleb lit a single candle. No ceremony, no crowd. He stood alone on the dock, the wind cold against his face, the lake perfectly still. He whispered something, but no one heard. And that was the point. Some love stories don't need to echo, they just need to exist. Not every truth needs validation. Not every bond needs a title, and not every inheritance needs to be understood by the world to matter deeply to the one who received it. If someone loved you in silence for years, would you need the world to approve, or would their quiet devotion be enough? If this story moved you, share it with someone who believes that not all love needs permission. And if your heart carries a story too, you might find you're not alone here at Heart Stories.